Welcome to Therapy Sessions Cutting Toxic Family Ties. My name is Dr. Sherry Campbell, and I'm your host. I am a leading expert in the niche of toxic family abuse, and although my show cannot substitute for therapy, it is a survivor-based show. In me, you're not only going to get an expert, but you're also going to get a survivor, as I have also survived toxic family abuse. I know how hard it is. The goal I have is to give voice to the voiceless, to provide skills to help you to protect your peace, to stand your solid ground, and to navigate and heal the heartbreaks caused by toxic family. Please have a pen and paper available to give voice to your thoughts as you listen to each show. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for your bravery. So let the healing begin. Welcome back, everyone, to Therapy Sessions Cutting Toxic Family Ties. And I'm so excited. I have the ex-wife of the Wolf of Wall Street on my show today, Dr. Nadine Macaluso. And I'm so excited to have this conversation, Nadine. So just welcome to Therapy Sessions.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to this. Yes.
So tell us, you've got a book out called Run Like Hell. I've referred it to 3 of my patients. I read the book, and I really want to talk to you a lot today about trauma bonds. My niche, as you know, is my parents were like your husband.
Yeah.
Outside of that, the seduction aspect of the trauma bonding, the idealizing, devaluing, discarding, hoovering, really isn't necessary for children because we're just already a part of the process. But in your book, I love the way that you describe a trauma bond. Will you kind of unpack that for the people listening? Because I think it's genius.
Yeah. So, at its most basic form, a trauma bond is a dysfunctional relationship between 2 emotionally attached people. But for it to actually be a true trauma bond, 2 conditions have to be present. And the first one is a power imbalance. And so power simply means someone has the ability to influence you, right? In a trauma bond, it's like somebody uses their power to control you. But in general, that's what power means. And how does somebody get the power? A, they have more resources. B, just simply because you love them. They can have power over you, right? And C, what happened with me is my ex-husband was very dominating, intimidating, and threatening. So that's how he got power over me. And then the second thing is intermittent reinforcement. And that's when 70% of the time they're cruel, controlling, abusive, degrading, they're betraying you. But that 30% of the time, they're generous, warm, helpful, caring, and kind. And so those 2 conditions have to be present for it to be a true trauma bond.
Yeah. So let's unpack that a little bit, because as I'm listening as a child, parents clearly have the power.
Clearly.
I mean, there's not even a shot for the child to even balance that out. They have the resources, they've got the money, and they can be incredibly intimidating. My dad was extremely violent. And not just on me, but violent in front of me on other people.
Right.
And not even just with his body, his words, his whole energy. Right. And then what was always so hard for me growing up, and so many people in my following, is I would get doped up on hope from those dollops of the kindness. Right.
Yes.
And then I realized, and I wonder if you know anything about this, but the hysterical trauma bond is like after a really significant event happened. When I was 7, my dad punched me in the face because I accidentally kicked him while he was tickling me.
Oh.
And he bloodied my nose, and that was new. I'd never had that happen before. But he left me by myself, and he went down the hallway and he locked himself in a room. And I went and took care of him. I felt such a need to connect with him because I had thought that I had done something very bad because I had accidentally kicked him. When, you're tickling a child, they tend to kick and squirm, as would be expected. But the more sometimes that they would be cruel to me, the more I wanted comfort from them. I wanted them to
Yeah,
fix that, right? And that hope, because then after that type of event, he would be very nice. And his hitting me actually hurt me a lot less through my life than the things he would say to me that were just so awful. But
sure.
that those doses of kindness really get us stuck in that hope.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I always say hope is the hook. It really keeps you hooked in. And of course, for a child, it's very different because we literally need the parent to survive, right? So the thought of losing the attachment to the parent really feels like death.
Yeah, and I think it is, and it's something that and I'm sure that you went through this in the love relationship, they dangle the loss of them
Of
as a
course.
manipulative technique. There's
Yes.
always the threat that they're going to leave you, and so you are left, and as you're a child and you're in that dependency space because you just have to be. So when I was reading your book, I actually stopped my workout and I'm like, I need a highlighter because the way that you spoke about power, I just so appreciate the wording that you used, Nadine. I've been doing this work for many years, but sometimes when you hear the same thing with a different verbiage, it
Yes.
kind of just sits in your soul a bit differently.
Yes.
And the way that you explained power, I just so appreciate how you put it because it just kind of clears the way for children have no power,
They have no.
right? How do you feel that your ex has been as a father?
That's a great question because, we would assume that, he would just be the most horrific father. But that's not really the case. So, what happened was that the reason why I was finally able to leave my ex was because he got arrested.
Well,
So,
that helps.
yeah, that helped. So, when I always say to my patients, you don't have that same luxury that I had, right? So, once he
True.
got arrested, the power balance changed.
God, that makes so much sense. Right.
Right? So I now almost have a little bit more power,
Yeah.
right? The only because he had to deal with the FBI and the government, and he was a witness for them, and so that was the reason why I left him because I knew I would be safe and I knew I could take my children because it was so clear he's bad, I'm good. You're a criminal. Now the whole world can see it. So, and I did have more power, but I'm different. I didn't abuse my power. And I always kept the lane for him to have access to his children open. As
I
long
like
as,
that.
yeah, as long as he showed up and
Yep.
was good and kind with them. And you have to remember, after he got arrested, he was very much more humble, right? So the dynamic shifted, he shifted, I shifted, and I moved to Los Angeles, and then 2 years later he did come and be with us, not with us, but so he could be
Mhm.
close to his children.
So in a way, you're so fortunate, right? I
Yeah.
think that many parents should be in jail.
Yes.
And because they have a parent title, I think they would go to their grave with ever not having the humility that,
Correct.
right, that your husband went through because you meet as equals essentially as adults. But with children, I don't know if you watched the treadmill abuser, the man that abused his child on the treadmill, and then the child passed away
Oh,
from internal injuries, and he only got 25 years. And he murdered his child, right? And he was 6 years old, and there's no way this kid could have stayed on this treadmill the way this man was doing it. And he
wow.
didn't humble in court. He didn't apologize. Of course, it's everybody else's whatever. A parent would never hurt the
Yeah.
child, right?
Yeah.
So I love that, whatever happened to your ex, it's like you got your power and you're
Yeah.
right. Like to your clients, you've got to be like, I was so lucky in some respect because
So lucky. I feel
he
bad for
lost
them.
his
Yeah.
power.
He lost all
Do
his
you
power.
think that, do you think that he is a narcissist or do you think that he awakened somewhat to the narcissism and then was able to turn some things around. Like, how does he treat you today? And how is he feeling about your story being out there?
Yeah, we always managed to have a decent relationship. I actually had him over the day the movie came out. So, but that doesn't mean we didn't have our arguments because we're two very strong-willed people. And today we get along just fine. Initially, when I started to tell my story, he was not happy about it. And it was bumpy. But I said to him, or, I just said to my children, he could write a book and make a movie. I could do a 3-minute TikTok. And he's not going to bully me. He's not going to stop me from telling my story because I have to walk my talk. Because he was like, I can't believe your mother's doing this, playing the victim. I said,
Did you not go to the movie? I mean,
oh, is Jordan my victim now? It's not happening. Right. But my daughter's a therapist. I have a wonderful relationship with my children. And
yeah.
it got a little sticky, but I didn't back down. And now he fully accepts it. And I sent him a copy of my book and I said, I want to be respectful. Here's a copy of my book. It's not about you. And he said, best of luck with it. Now the fun starts. So that doesn't mean that we haven't tussled, right?
Yeah.
But we've been able to.
Sounds like he had at least some level of humility. I mean, I think when
Yes.
he lived the life that he did, and he wasn't really asking for permission, but kind of expecting forgiveness, right?
Right.
And he's really amoral, really, truly just very, amoral. And he got caught, right? And I do think that getting caught like that on such a big level can be like, oh shit, like I really need to get it together. Um, and I think that thank God for your children, he did, because I live in a world and I'm working with a whole community of people whose parents would rather die and go to their graves than say that they were wrong and see their grandchildren and their children ever again.
Yes.
Right. And we don't ever have that awakening. And then we have to protect our children from the grandparents. And yet grandparents in society are like Mr. and Mrs. Claus and,
Right.
everyone gets along. And so I think that when the law steps in, there was a benefit. And I think it must have just really benefited your children as well, because they got to see a change maybe in their father that someone like me would always wish for, but that won't ever happen, right?
Yeah. Right.
And yet your kids know the fullness of the truth. I'm such a believer that we have to adhere to truth.
Yes.
And that what our kids as parents need to know is the truth, and it will serve your children to know your truth.
Yes. Yes.
And I can't believe, it's kind of like a lot of audacity on his end to say, don't you write that book? You're like, I don't know. Did you not see the movie? Okay, Margot Robbie's hot and I love that part. But
yeah,
I just think like that was your life put in a movie that was like one of the most watched movies. And it's one of the most famous movies still today.
yes.
What was that like for you? And was it accurate? Did you feel that it was accurate, or how did you feel about it?
You know what? Luckily for me, I've been in therapy for 25 years. Hence, I am a somewhat normally, functioning individual. First, you wrote a book, right? So then I got kind of titrated into the process a little bit. So first it was a book. I had a big reaction to it because I allow myself to have my full expression of emotions. And then I was like, okay, it's a book, whatever. Then it's going to become a movie. And I did a lot of therapy around that. And I did a lot of dream therapy around it, actually. And so I had so many emotions again. But then one day I said to myself, you know what, Nadine, this is bigger than you. And you have to surrender into this process. You have to let go and surrender. And I did. And then I got a private screening at Paramount with my husband. And it was weird. I'm like, okay, this is so surreal. I'm going to see my life. But then I saw the movie and I was like, wasn't that bad? You know?
Maybe in some way it could have maybe even been validating.
Yeah. And, I was really more concerned, how are my kids going to be?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so luckily, as you just said, I had told them the truth from the beginning.
Yeah.
Your dad was a criminal. He went to jail. He did too many drugs. I didn't disparage him, but I told them the facts. So they were not shocked by this because we always processed and talked about everything. And when I saw the movie, I was like, you know what? It's not that bad. I just look like a young girl who loved this crazy man and wanted to protect her kids.
And
And
really, that is who you are and who you were. It's so
yeah,
authentic to your person and to your intention in being in this world, right? Is to
yeah.
just be true to your children and to the love that you were feeling at that time. And you really were so young.
Oh
You
my
know,
God.
we talk a lot in our field about dual diagnosis, right? That drugs and alcohol can really exacerbate a character disorder if that character disorder is there. And sometimes it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the
Yes.
egg, right?
Yeah.
And do you feel, Nadine, that, getting really in big trouble and maybe, I don't know if he's sober or not, but that coming off all of those substances also helped him humble and kind of
Yeah.
like, do you feel like he's taken ownership for the pain that he's caused?
That I don't really know because I would never want to speak for him.
Mhm.
But um, I think that you bring up a really good point about the substance abuse and the personality disorders. When I was with him, I was so focused on the substance abuse because it was, as you saw in the movie, it was so out of control. And I was so young. I didn't understand the personality disorder and the mood disorder, right, that was behind it at all. And that's why when I left him and everybody just was like, you're codependent and you're an addict. And inside, I was like, I think there's something more going on. But right, 25 years ago,
It wasn't
nobody was
labeled.
talking about this.
I know. I know. We grew up in a time where, when I went to therapy for the first time, there was no narcissism, there was no
Right,
borderline, there was no
right.
sociopath, there was no dependent, antisocial. Like, I had cancer, but really didn't know what kind. I didn't really know it was like actually my mom. It was never very much described what was done to me, but I
Yeah,
was told that I wasn't the problem. I was a symptom of the problem, but we didn't
yeah,
label. So back then it was like codependent. And that was like the big
that was
weight.
it.
That was
And
it.
because I'm reflective, and I was in therapy through my whole marriage, and that's why I became a therapist because I believe that's what saved me. I was like, okay, I'm
Mm.
codependent. I'm codependent. I gotta fix myself. I gotta fix myself.
Yeah.
And nothing bad came from it, but
No.
that really was not what was happening there.
Exactly. When I was codependent, it was like there was something wrong with me.
Yeah,
And I was
right,
just trying.
right.
I'm sure I read Codependent No More and I did all the
No,
books.
yes,
I
yes.
saw myself. I saw myself, but at the same respect, it made me the problem rather than
And
the
him.
problem.
That's
Yes.
And here's the thing, this is why I wrote my book, is to break the stigma for the victim
Wow.
because his drug addiction, his abuse was never my fault.
No.
But
No.
that codependency label makes you think it is. Oh, you're trying to fix him, you're enabling him. I didn't enable him
No.
to be verbally, emotionally abusive and coercively
No.
controlling.
I did a TED talk last September, and one of the things I say is children do not cause bad parents.
That's right.
First of all, how is that even possible
It's not.
that this younger, more vulnerable human being who's actually completely dependent on this person? But society is very uncomfortable to talk about the problematic character of parents in a
Mm,
culturally open and safe space because it's so painful, I think, to go against that cognitive dissonance that
yeah,
parents really might be abusing their children in the home.
yeah,
And I feel like when you get the label, yes, it was healing for me to recognize I was codependent, but I didn't feel powerless. And the way that it was verbalized was like, you have to fix you. You're the
right,
problem. You're
right,
needy.
right,
You're pleasing. You're this, you're that.
right.
You're codependent. And it was such an ugly label. I'm like, ew, I want to,
Yeah, yeah,
okay, I might have some of that, but I'm also powerful. And this is going to sound twisted, but if I wasn't a strong person, Nadine, and if you weren't a
yeah,
strong person, we
yeah.
wouldn't have survived.
No, no, no. And right. And that's the thing that just made me so crazy with that label. I am a very independent woman. Right. And that's why I loved it when I read Sandra Brown's work in Women Who Love Psychopaths, when she really turned the head on the personality traits. of,
Yes.
I am agreeable, I am loyal, I am tolerant, I am conscientious. Those are great personality traits, but in
Yes.
the hands of an abuser, they get weaponized.
Yes, they do. And with a child, they're
They're
just
right.
inherently in that place, not even by choice because the brain development isn't even there,
Yeah.
right? So we're just at the mercy of parents that are scary and toxic and unpredictable. And what other choice do we have? We're going to go be independent at 5.
No,
Like, right?
no.
We're not going to do that. So I had to really learn. I'd always been very independent because the way that I survived was through isolation. I
Okay.
just tried to vapor myself and just be,
Like be invisible?
yeah, until high school. And then I was pretty angry. There's 9 marriages between my parents. So it
Wow.
wasn't just each individual parent that was harmful. They weren't attracting healthy partners, as you can imagine, either. Then
Ooh,
all of that change was dragging me through. And at some point, I got very, very angry and it was all coming out. And then I was bad. I was scapegoated and I was got a bad reputation. I wasn't passing school, like all those things.
no, of course, of course.
But,
How could you?
I look at it now, and another thing that I loved about your book is what I want people in every community, that's whether it's marriage and divorce or my community of toxic family, toxic parents, is happiness is really possible.
Yes.
And that I sort of started a movement of no contact in the family realm. There isn't a book before mine really that talks about it. I was afraid I'd be stoned off the earth for actually writing about it, but I was left no other choice.
No, of course. It
And
certainly sounds like it.
and it happened in midlife. It
Mhm.
wasn't a tantrum I had at 18 where I'm angry and I'm not
Yeah,
going to talk to you for a few days. It
right.
was I was cut off and that was the game and I didn't mend the fence anymore. And now it's been 8 years. And no contact doesn't solve my trauma. It just protects my future.
Yeah,
It's not about anger, it's about surrender,
yeah,
right? And knowing like this is just never going to change. And when you're in that situation and he gets arrested, it's almost like it sets you free. You're like a bird that got out of a cage.
yes,
And I wonder, I'm so thankful that happened for you, right? Because you got to really get out. I think it would have been harder maybe to get
right.
out had
Sure.
that not happened.
Oh, much harder.
How
That's
do
why
you
we
look,
have to
when you
leave.
look back at that time in your life, how do you view it from today?
I view it with a lot of compassion towards myself, because I really went into this marriage and this life with him just with the intention to love him, have connection with him, build a family with him, celebrate holidays, have lots of memories. And when I look back at that girl, I just have so much compassion for her because she was naive. She didn't understand all these things. And she didn't know that she was marrying someone with a very different intention. And it's interesting because I'm back in New York now and I'm actually in the area that I lived with him in. So I get to drive around and say, God, 25 years ago, I never would have thought that I'd be here. As you know, when you're in it, it's so overwhelming and it
Yes.
takes up so much of your life and your energy and your thoughts.
Yeah.
And so that young girl was afraid and I have
Yeah.
just compassion for her.
Yeah. I was afraid for you
Yeah.
watching the movie. And I
Yeah.
read your book before watching the movie. And so it was just a nice dichotomy, right? To see what you've done. And I felt hopeless for such a long time, especially after no contact was initiated. In my new book, I talk about a space of like no man's land because the terrifying things that were happening after no contact were in some ways scarier than kind of knowing daily something was going to happen. I would never be able to
Sure.
predict what it was, but
Yeah.
to know had me completely frozen. And I kind of had my ear to that life and never was starting this new life because I was so afraid to start it because they would try to destroy me. Right.
Mm,
And so I stayed frozen for a long time and I didn't go home to where I grew up for like 7 years.
yeah.
I grew up in a very beautiful mountain area and when I did go home, it was like my little girl was there. And like
Yeah.
we drove by my little girl house and I escaped into Pippi Longstocking and Annie and
Yeah.
Punky Brewster, all the outcast kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had a little world of stuffed animals. And I have, my own little world at that house was good and I could be outside a lot and get away. But there were other ghosts around the corner going back and I would find myself kind of triggered back into the small child or the 18, 19, 20-year-old who was kind of lost
Yeah.
and being abused. And it just kind of made me feel like, wow, the perspective that I have on who I was as compared to who I am today made me really proud of myself. And I imagine that you feel the same way because the life that you were living was insane.
Insane.
Like insane. The extravagance was insane. Everything was a yes, everything was so abundant that
Yeah.
I don't know how you can even feel that type of stuff,
Yeah.
because there's so much of it. Like I look at certain celebrities that have risked everything. They have a $54 million home. They're married to a supermodel. They're gorgeous. They have this, and then they go cheat or something and they get caught. And I'm like, if you have all of that and you're not happy,
I know.
you are actually the most sad
Yeah.
of all the people because
Right.
you have everything and you're not happy. And that tells us that happiness is
Inside.
inside. And I can see after watching the movie and some of the clips I've seen in your other interviews, it was insane.
Yeah. It was certainly over the top, but that's that personality, right? He's a real grandiose narcissist. Like
Yeah.
quintessential, he either goes big or goes home. And we were so young and there was just so much money and he was in charge and he was in charge of all these young men, right, who were
Yeah.
like
Oh,
soldiers,
yeah.
all of his
And
yes.
honestly, he literally started from like the
Yeah.
bottom
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
that little office. I could see how that could be so attractive. And you were like 22, like you were
I
a
was
baby.
so young and he was 28 and I was from Brooklyn and he was from Queens and we just really, really got along.
Yeah.
And
And seemingly you still very much do.
yeah, we
You
do.
know,
We
I
do.
I think not having the addiction maybe as, I don't know anything about your ex-husband other than what I've heard and learned from you, but helps. I used to wish that either of my parents had some addiction
Mm,
just to soften the blow. That
yeah,
it's that's something to protect me a little bit from like, no, it's just actually me.
right.
Right. Because a child doesn't have any other refuting evidence, and I had a sibling who was treated completely differently than I was.
Oh,
And it was done by intent just to show me how lowly I was.
oh. I want to ask you about this
Yeah.
because this is also with the survivor in a trauma bond
Yeah.
about the shame, right? There's so
Yeah.
much shame and so much self blame
Yeah.
that really, and then with the child too, we know the shame and the child has to blame themselves.
There's no choice. Yeah.
Right?
And I think that the shame, it just took me into a true deep seated belief that I was fatally flawed,
Yeah.
but no one would tell me what the flaw was. And so
Right.
I couldn't fix it.
Right.
The
Right.
flaw is that the way that my spirit has been in this world is I've always just seen the truth. And then when you're little, you don't know not to say the truth.
That's right.
So then I started getting punished for that very, very young.
Yeah. For
Whereas
Nate.
my sibling was he's a boy, so he was out doing active activity things and he didn't pay as much attention. I was a much more sensitive child.
Yeah.
And I also think that my mother hates women and my dad has no respect he's passed. He had no respect for women. So my brother just being of the opposite sex, I think benefited him quite a bit.
Yeah.
But to let me know that I wasn't loved, they would douse him with love.
Mm.
and it was made clear to me.
Yeah.
Right. And that shame, the gift of the shame, honestly, Nadine, is it took me so deep into myself that I had no other choice but to find myself. I was given no other choice. Like your husband went to jail. I got forced into a position where it was find me, do or die. And I found me.
And you found you.
And
Yeah.
I found me. And that's possible. And I just, it is possible. You can find yourself, because
Yeah.
after so much, there's a bandwidth I think we all have as human beings where enough is enough.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
I found that. And I found that. And I'm very blessed to have found that.
Yeah. For
Right.
sure.
Because when you look at shame and when it goes into your story, you were being treated so badly behind your back.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's a humiliating feeling to think, well, one, why am I not good enough? Why are there all these other women? And how many people know? And like, this is my life. And now it's in a movie, and
Yeah.
all of the vulnerabilities. Yeah. I mean, shame was really powerful. What advice would you give to people around shame and healing their shame?
Yeah. So what I do with my patients is I have like a shame list of statements, and
Mm-hmm.
they look through the statements and they see, because you can be like, you can want to be perfect to cover shame. You can
Yes.
overachieve to cover shame. You can tell yourself very cruel things to just keep adding to your shame. Right. So what I say to them, I say, first of all, I just want to tell you, you're shaming yourself.
Yes.
So here's the good news. Since you're doing it, you can change it,
That's right.
right? Nobody outside is shaming you. And then I
That's right.
give them, based upon what of their shaming statements are, I give them a list of affirming, validating statements to contraindicate those. And I say, you have to write that every morning, every night before you go to sleep to
Yeah.
get into your prefrontal cortex. And then I actually have a shame compass, because I'm really into shame, Sherry.
Yeah. Yeah. I get it.
And then where I say, do you act in? Do you act out? Do you
That's
avoid,
right.
withdraw? And then
Yeah.
I have an opposing self-acceptance. So I
Yeah.
give them these tools to help them like tangibly understand shame,
Yeah.
because I feel like shame is a process almost more
I
than a
do too.
feeling,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
And I
that's
think
what I
shame
do.
doesn't move.
Right.
Guilt can inspire healthy guilt, can inspire motivation.
That's right.
Like, oh, I didn't do that well. I feel kind of bad. He was in a bad mood or whatever. But shame really blames.
Yeah. And
You either blame yourself or you're blaming someone else. And what I tell my clients is self-abuse is still abuse.
that's right.
So if your inner talking is that of your parents, then you're abusing you for them now.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So I do a lot of very similar things around shame and maladaptive guilt.
Yeah.
And I think too, we can be all the things you listed at once. We can be perfectionistic and we can be self-doubting. We
Yeah.
can be
Yes.
overachieving and we can shame ourselves for not doing enough. Like, it's so deep what shame does. And I also think that shame really brings us, if we can use it and write it and acknowledge it and be conscious of it, it is one of the greatest teachers of self-awareness that we've got.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And looking like I'm still doing this to myself. And I went no contact to no longer have that. So now I need to protect myself from
That's right.
myself.
That's right. That's right. And because when we often do what was done to us, not
100%.
intentionally, but we internalize all that, right?
Yeah.
So, and the same thing is for a victim in a trauma bond. A lot of times, if
Yes.
she internalizes all of those disparaging, insulting, cruel comments, she can start to believe them.
Oh, yeah. I think that we do, especially when we're in it. We're
Yes.
kind of believing it because one of the things I think narcissists bank on is confusion.
Yeah.
And confusion robs us of rational thought, and it also erodes resiliency. And
Mm.
so I was head spun my whole childhood because the confusion was so intense. Like, I wouldn't really know what I did wrong, but clearly my existence was wrong. So
Mm.
I could be shamed with a look.
Right.
Like, it'd be, like, oh, she's in the room type of thing, or I'd get the narcissistic stare. It doesn't take much. And the confusion is always like, how can I fix this. I want
Yeah.
it to be better. So how can I fix it? And then it does. It robs us of rational thought.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
removes resiliency. That's where they want us.
Yeah. And that's what the cognitive dissonance does, right? Is he
Yeah.
good? Is he bad? Am I good? Or is he bad? Is the relationship good? Is the relationship bad? Right? That executive functioning goes offline. You can't
Yes.
strategize. You can't organize. You can't make a decision. And you're right. It's that confusion. The
Yeah.
confusion mixed with the hope, with the shame, is
I
a pretty
know.
crazy cauldron.
And then when it erodes the resiliency, going back to your concept of power,
Yeah.
you're confused and you're running out of resiliency to fight for yourself. It just increases their power, and that's what's hard is because you start to, was recognizing I'm losing grip of my hold on me.
Yes.
And, that didn't start coming until the teenage years where I even had a me to hold on to because, identity and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
do you think, Nadine, that there's anything from your childhood and your upbringing? Because I know you're very close to your mom. Is there anything that that you think you were attracted to Jordan from any trauma from a childhood wound? Or did it just happened to be,
I
you
think
ran
that,
into each other?
I think that the home that I grew up in, I was very blessed. My mom left my dad when I was 6. And so I had a very calm, peaceful childhood.
Yeah.
Now, I don't remember those first 6 years really.
That's interesting. Yeah.
They're in my implicit memory.
Correct.
But so my dad, I don't speak to him.
Okay.
I chose not to. He was never mean to me. He was never cruel to me, but he was like a Disneyland dad, and he had gambling issues. So I just chose not to deal with him. But if you think about it, the stock market is legal gambling.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, well, I'm seeing a lot of commonalities here, right? Like Disneyland,
Yeah.
the extravagance,
So
the addiction.
Yeah. So I wasn't.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it wasn't like I was abused and then I took abuse, but it was,
Right.
I think, in my implicit memory of that masculine energy per se.
Yes. Yeah,
Right?
the charismatic masculine.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is my father still to this day. Right.
Yeah.
And that is my ex-husband. So I think in that way, it did, unbeknownst to me, program me.
Right.
And then when I met Jordan, though, and he started with this rage, I was like, what is this?
Yeah, because you had such a quiet home.
Yes.
Yeah, that had to be so scary. See, I grew up
so
with rage.
scary.
And my first 5 years, I have memory dating back to 2. And I think it's because I was scared. Like I had to be very alert. My parents were hippies and there was a lot of drug parties and swapping of sexual partners happening in front of children. And CPS was called for the neglect of me at 2. They didn't take the report because back in the day, what was in the home sort of stayed in the home. But
Right.
I have repressed memories more throughout middle school and stuff that are a little spotty. But my childhood, I just remember like I really very young knew I had to be alert. I was alert. So when you don't have memory, it's like, why is that? And sometimes when you're someone like me, you had to have memory because I was remembering and imprinting like, don't be around when it's like this, but I'm 2, 2.5, right? And I have memory from that time, not tons, but enough to know that I remember those things, right? So, I think a lot of us coming from toxic families, we kind of have a pattern of then finding that, in partners and friends and even bosses.
Yes.
And I like your story because it wasn't as toxic as what I grew up in, but there was still something there. And they say that we marry our most toxic parent, because that's where the unresolved issues are. And they do have a lot of commonality. And yet there wasn't a ton of trauma because a lot of people feel like they would recognize it if they saw it. And here's the thing I tell people, if you have a good heart,
you don't recognize
you're not going to recognize it. Your MD won't matter. Your PhD won't matter. Nothing's going to matter because you're not going to recognize it because reverse projection is you're going to project all of your good qualities onto them and give them the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly it. And
right.
too, I write about that, like that invisible ship metaphor.
Yes. Explain that.
Yeah, so when the Native Americans were like looking right out in the water and they saw these ships coming from Europe, they thought that they were gods coming to save them because
Yes.
they had no reference for them. And that was the same thing. I had no reference for this rage and control and abuse. So when it was coming at me, I was just like, where am I? What's happening?
Right.
I had no, my mother said, she
I,
was English and she would say, don't you dare do that. Well, she was reading Freud and Jung and she was very
yeah.
psychological. So
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
was very progressive, but I had no reference point for that sort
No.
of life.
And I love that metaphor because, if we have younger, mid 20s listening to the show and they're going to be married soon,
That's
that's really something to look for. And I'm so glad you brought that up because that metaphor is so brilliant in that you thought, they thought they were gods coming to save them, and
right.
that is really what a narcissist feels like. And even though seduction isn't necessary for children, when those intermittent doses of kindness were given to me, it felt very similar to that. Like I
Yeah.
would think, oh my God, it's like we're going to get along now. Maybe it's over.
Yeah,
But
maybe
it
this.
was more like getting me back in, right? And I feel like they love to idealize and they love to discard, but they don't want to do the work of the relationship. So as soon as
Yeah,
you actually have a need, they devalue, right? So I
right.
think those things are important for everybody to know. And I just want to thank you, Nadine. This went so fast. I want to thank you for coming on my show. What words of hope would you give to a woman lost in a lifestyle like yours? And let's say that the arrest doesn't happen for her.
Yeah.
How does she get out? What would you advise her?
Well, first of all, I think you have to accept that you're in a trauma bond if you're in one and really come to terms with the fact that you're in a toxic, dysfunctional relationship. And that's okay because it doesn't have to be forever. The
Hmm.
first thing is when we accept it and we recognize what we're in, then reach out to the helpers, like Mr. Rogers says. Find
Yes.
a trauma informed therapist, right? Don't isolate, talk to safe people about it
Yeah.
because you need reflection back to you about what you're in and it's totally crazy. And then start to turn the mirror back on you and start to do some work on yourself. And if you can, do things that build your confidence
Yes.
outside of the relationship so that
Yeah.
you can start to build your self esteem because one day you will leave.
Yes. One day you will. I like the Peloton equipment, so I have all that at home. And
Yeah,
one of my coaches she always says, yes, you can.
that's right.
And yes, you can. And two, I would love to just say that you're so inspiring.
Oh, thank you so much.
And
Oh, yeah.
what a beautiful spirit and humble person that you are. And you're doing so much good.
Thank
And
you.
I think the harder thing about the trauma bond between a man and a woman or a sexual partner is the sex,
Yeah,
right? There's a bond when you're sharing a body with somebody that, is a different kind of heartbreak than a parent, right? But I think it's very chemical.
yep,
And one of the things I would love for our listeners to hear from today is when you search to educate yourself and you start learning, you start going to therapy and you start reading, remember that you're doing that for you. Understanding these people doesn't change them.
exactly.
Understanding them needs to change you.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Right?
Name all the things and all, gaslighting and this and that, but
Yeah,
that doesn't really going to a trauma informed therapist and
that's
expert
right.
who understands your nervous system and your brain and your attachment patterns, right? That
Yes,
that's what you need to go do. And and it's all possible because look at us. We're just sitting here talking and
exactly. Yeah, it's like I always say that I'm a survivor. I'm not a victim. I was victimized, and that is a true part of who I am. And I've got some monsters in my basement wounding that I work on, and I'm writing that workbook now. But I love what's that quote that says that in the word impossible is I'm possible.
oh, I like that. I've never heard that. That's lovely.
And I just think that you and I can show survivors of different communities, but of the same type of abuse because they all go to the same school. my parents abused the same exact way that your husband abused.
Same Hogwarts school.
The Hogwarts school for character disorders, right?
Yes.
And I do think that you can have a fun, happy, loving, and that the trauma can stop. I'm so close to my kids, to my daughter and my stepsons, and you're so close to your children. And
So close.
all of that bonding is possible. If you take care of you, I think the rest takes care of itself.
It's so
And you're
true.
so inspiring, and I'm so thrilled. This is going to help so many people. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely.
All right, guys, my community of brave hearts, be well and take care of you over the next couple of weeks, and we'll talk soon. Well, brave hearts, that concludes our amazing therapy session for the day. Please sign up on my email list at drsherrycampbell.com so that you can be in touch with me and see what's going on in terms of what I'm offering soon, what books are coming out, etc. Talk to you in a couple of weeks.